And good morning, everyone. Welcome to this edition of the Executive Next Practice Innovator interview with Tom Rieger this morning. Welcome all. I want to just do a brief introduction for you about what this exciting interview we're going to have this morning. First of all, I want to give you just a little bit of background here about who Executive Next Practice is. I'm your host. I'm CEO of the Executive Next Practice Institute. We're based at the University of California, Irvine, Applied Innovation. We also run Next Work Strategy here at this center. Welcome to our 381st edition of these interview forums. Today, we'd like you to submit your questions in real time, either using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, or the chat feature. Either one works, but again, we look forward to your questions. This will be a very interactive session this morning. Again, the private chat feature is available if you want to send us, either one of us, a private note during the course of the event. As I mentioned, we've had now over 380 sessions around the world, over 60,000 now, 60,000 attendees. This is what it looks like. I'm going to put all this up at once. Our organization looks at emerging trends. That is what the general public has not seen yet, what's not readily available on the internet. And today is a perfect case in point. We're looking at a about to be published work by a noted author. So you're getting a first look at what this book is all about. We're also about connection at the key C-suite enterprise leader level, director level and above. Again, our organization, several thousand of these folks that are from major enterprises, anywhere from 10 million in revenue up to 100 billion in revenue. So with our organization, now in our 11th year, you'll get a chance to meet these individuals, converse with them, and hopefully form some next practices for your own organization that represent a move forward for you as an organization. As we look forward, I just want to kind of give you a clue about what we're doing here over the next few weeks. As you probably have looked at our website, we have 2 events per week. One is an interview with these noted global innovators each week on Tuesdays. And on Thursdays, we have a workshop or seminar on some major issue that's coming up. This Thursday, please be sure to attend this session on the rebound to the next normal. We have Liz Pellet, John Hopkins Fellow, talking about not only culture, but also some specific strategies you can use to get back to revenue faster. Then, of course, we go on to May and into May with these different sessions. They're generally at 11 o'clock Pacific time. These are complimentary. We invite you to join these over the coming weeks. Also, as I mentioned, regular interviews with Next Practice Innovators. We have Mark Bounty coming up next week, author of Radical Value. Looking forward to talking with him. Now, without further ado, let's move into today. You can find us as we move forward at our events page. Again, this is updated weekly, so join our newsletter, get involved with us. You will see something of value, either a global or local basis every week. We have a YouTube channel. Please subscribe to that. You'll see this tape as well as others. These sessions are all archived on our ENP TV location. And then finally, join as an annual member. Those that join as an annual member can attend all virtual events and our coming live events through 2021. All right, with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Tom Rieger, author of The Fear Barrier, and also the upcoming curing organization, Blindness. So let me just give you a little bit about Tom. We're just delighted to have him back again. He's been a previous speaker at our Neuro Leadership event that the Executive Next Practice put on. Again, as I mentioned, he's the author of the best-selling book, Breaking the Fear Barrier, as well as this new book we'll talk about today. Tom's got a wealth of experience, over 30 years experience working with organizations in both the public and private sector. He's currently president of NSI as well as their commercial-facing entity, NBI. Both these companies are leveraging the latest in social and behavioral science to tackle some of the most difficult problems faced by governments and private industries. Tom, welcome. Glad to have you with us again.
Thank you, Scott. Glad to be here. Really appreciate the invite.
Well, let's just for a moment before we get into this, tell us a little bit about why the topic of organization blindness? Why now? Why in the midst of this current situation we have?
Well, Scott, this is something that I've noticed as a problem that's been very pervasive and getting worse in our society, really over the past 10 years, but more severely lately, where not only have we become very polarized as a society, which is not what the book is really getting at, but there's a lot of that polarization and that type of thinking that's starting to seep into different organizations. But beyond that, there really has never been a time where we've had such a deluge of information to try to sort through. So many threats, so many demands, so much pressure put on us every minute of every day that that makes us vulnerable to making poor decisions. When our minds are faced with all those threats, with all that stress, with that time pressure, you walk into your office in the morning, you've got 167 emails, you've got back-to-back Zoom meetings, conference calls, maybe 30 minutes for lunch, and that gets taken up for something else. You've got people demanding this, demanding that. You've got other groups threatening to derail you. So in the face of all that pressure, we're expecting people to be thoroughly logical and deliberative, and it just doesn't happen. We become vulnerable to certain blind spots, and the intent of the book was to try to provide some light and some insight into what those are, why they happen, and provide some strategies to assist. Add in COVID-19 and all the social isolation, and there's a whole new set of threats that we have to deal with.
Yeah, it's interesting. And, a lot of people are still talking about your fear barrier book, since you spoke about it at our last forum when we were met together live. How is this new book different than the fear barrier, the last book?
That's a great question, Scott. So with the barrier book, the whole point of that book is there were certain things that were beyond the control of individual managers and teams. So in doing that work over the past years, the question I would always get is, well, what can I do? What can I do as a leader, as an individual contributor, to not only not create barriers myself, but to make better decisions, to not fall into these cognitive traps that lead to some of these short-sighted moves.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, I know you want to get into some examples for us, and maybe let's do this. I know you've got prepared a short number of slides to kind of give us some context for this issue around organizational blind spots. So I'm going to stop share and allow you to share your PowerPoint here.
Sounds good.
In fact, I'm going to take myself off here for a moment. All right.
Okay, let me pull up mine. Give me 1 second. Okay, so if we go back to the beginning, and I promised Scott that I won't talk for more than 15 minutes. So I'm going to go through this quickly, but there'll be chances to ask questions, and I'll make sure to leave some contact information too before we wrap up. But let's go back to the beginning and think about how we're wired. Let's think about how we evolved. We are instinctive beings, and we're built for survival. So we have had to evolve being able to react very quickly to all sorts of threats. And while those threats may have kept us from becoming some saber-toothed tiger's dinner at a predator dinner party thousands of years ago, those same instincts are still there. And if we leave them to themselves, since we are such emotional and instinctive creatures, that makes us vulnerable to what I call organizational blindness. That in the face of all that primordial emotion and instinct, it becomes very difficult for us to be logical, and that brings with it certain traps and landmines that we could fall into if we lack the awareness and strategies we need to stay out of that type of darkness. So let me talk a little bit about what that means and why we're talking about it here. So as I mentioned before, this is our new normal, right? I mean, we come into work, there's more demands than we could get done. We have not enough time to get the things done we need. We're constantly interrupted. There's more things hitting us. There are all sorts of things trying to derail us. And in the meantime, we're just trying to get done what we need to get done and carve out some measure of success. but we're doing it under a great deal of stress and a great deal of pressure. Now, add into that the new virtual reality, if you will. So we have all sorts of distractions from trying to balance things at home. We have the dog barking. We're trying to take care of the kids, keep things going, for the house. I have a very cranky 17-year-old cat that loves nothing more than a photobomb Zoom meeting. So hopefully he'll behave himself today. And in the midst of all that, we also have an intense social isolation from our normal contacts that we rely on as buffers to get through the day. So as a result of all this, our brains are assaulted, as I said, with all this stress, all these threats. So what does that do to our ability to process? So many of you may have read Danny Kahneman's great book, Thinking Fast and Slow, or heard about left brain, right brain, or the neocortex and prefrontal cortex versus the limbic system and reptilian brain. But all those things basically come down to one thought as it's relevant here today with what we're talking about. We have two ways of processing. One is emotional. It's based in survival. It's gut instinct. Think of our emotional brain as a sentry that has just had 30 cups of really strong espresso and is just ready and alert all the time. This sentry, this emotional brain, is reacting to stimuli as much as 200 times per second. 200 times per second, constantly reacting. And what we tend to do here is make emotional decisions, backfill them with logic, and convince ourselves that we were being logical all the time. Psychologist Jonathan Haidt wrote a great article called The Emotional Dog and Its Rational Tail. And that's basically what's happening here, is we're making emotional-based decisions and backfilling them with logic and then convincing ourselves we were going all that way all along. But we do have another side of our brain, if you will, which is mostly residing in the prefrontal cortex, where that cold, slow, deliberative, questioning logic exists. But this is not the sentry at his or her post. This is the part of our brain that's lying on the couch, eating potato chips, taking a nap. It's lazy. It takes effort to engage. It tends to defer to the emotional brain. And not only that, but things like stress, physical exhaustion, mental exhaustion, or too many tasks tend to shut it down. So think of the prior slides I showed. That's our world, and it's exacerbated by COVID-19. But if we want to be able to engage that part of our brain, we don't have to do it for every decision, but there are sometimes where we need to be more logical, we need to be more thorough. We have to realize it's going to take some effort to do that. And if not, we might end up very blind to that. So we have the tortoise, which is slow to react, where that more detailed, careful processing takes place. Then we have the hare that's instinctive, wants to get to the answer, form a team, and act. Get her done, as Larry the Cable Guy would say. So that puts us in a position where the default is to simplify, to unify, and to justify. So when dealing with information complexity, if I desperately need to tell a story, if I desperately need to be right, if my career relies on it, and I go out and there's one piece of information that says, yeah, that kind of agrees with what I'm saying, I'll be very tempted to grab onto that and stop. Or I may even dismiss things that I disagree with, or anchor onto one piece of information that I really like and then judge everything by that. Or even worse, I may just rely on my gut instinct. I mean, we all love the story about the intrepid hero who knows in their heart that they're right, despite all the facts and data, and somehow fights and wins. And that's very romantic, but in the words of Richard Thaler, the Nobel Prize winner, when it comes to assessing the chances of some complicated combination of events, gut feelings are pretty much useless. So we've gotten through that. We've grabbed the information. We've come to our conclusion. Then what do? We form a war party and we fight. We form a team, right? And that's fine in and of itself. All these fine things can be fine in and of themselves, but where it becomes damaging, where it leads us into a different blind spot, is when we use that team to silence debate, to make assumptions about other teams. Oh, those HR guys are just there to make things difficult, or oh, those finance guys are just here to say no. Where we start making attributions about other departments, or even outgrouping people who disagree. And then instead of being a judge trying to evaluate facts, we become a car salesman trying to sell our story, trying to justify why we're right instead of taking a step back to try to substantiate if we're right. So there's several specific traps that come with this, and the end result of this, and that's my cat Harry, by the way, is we sometimes end up making decisions that we're convinced are a great idea. And then afterwards, we think to ourselves, why did I do that? What in the world was I thinking? When we calm down, those threats lessen and the emotion starts to drop. But we virtually end up walking into the clothes dryer on multiple occasions. And I'm sure many people on the phone can think of examples where corporately some very bad decisions were made because of that pressure, because of that desire to win, forming the team, and then falling into some of the traps. So I'm just going to very quickly go through a couple of the more common traps that come with these blind spots. And I go into much more detail and some examples about each of these in the book, but I'm going to be brief so that we can get to the Q&A. One of the most common ones is confirmation bias. And I would argue when you get close to an election, and this is true every election, it's not just this year, social media becomes an exercise in confirmation bias. In fact, news sources, it's very hard to find a completely objective two-sided news source. Everything's very partisan these days. And confirmation bias is fun. It's really fun. You get to wrap yourself in this warm, fuzzy blanket of self-righteousness and just rant about how stupid the other side is. So it's something that unfortunately is how we're wired, and can be a default unless we're very careful about not falling into this trap. Another one is availability bias. So this is trusting our gut. This is grabbing what's easily recalled. Have you ever been in a presentation where there's a whole bunch of really dry charts and then someone tells a touching story? What do you remember? You remember the touching story because it's easily recalled. It's something that is easily made available, and it plays to your emotions. So you got to remember the emotional decision making will always take front and center stage over the careful thinking and logical calculation part of our decision making processes. So that's availability bias. Another one's anchoring bias. So you walk into a retailer, when you could actually walk into a retailer again, whatever that may be, and you see a shirt, let's say that's $100, but it's 50% off. So you can get a $100 shirt for $50. You think that's, wow, what a great deal. It's half the price. But what if they just marked it at $50 to begin with? Then it may not seem as much because you didn't have that anchor. So whatever that first piece of information is can be very powerful in how you interpret everything that follows. Why is that important? Let's say you're thinking of launching a product and you see one piece of data that says this particular product appeals more to women than men. Let's say 60% of women will buy 40% of men. And you stop there. You may decide, let's market it to women. But what if 80% of category buyers are males? Then you just made a mistake. Other examples, if someone has a sales bonus of $500,000 and they hit that $500,000, do they keep really pushing? What if their bonus was $750,000? If their goal was $750,000, then they may be more tempted to keep going. So whatever that anchor is, again, we're trying to simplify. So it's very tempting to just base everything in that anchor and then stop trying to reset. But your assumptions may change and you may not have the complete picture. So it's very careful not to allow yourself to think that. So if we move into some of the Unify traps, one of the most common ones is groupthink. Groupthink is a term that was coined by Irving Janis following the Bay of Pigs invasion. And it's been very well documented, but it's a tendency to not speak up if you feel like you maybe are the only one. and there's intense pressure to go along. Everyone's excited. Everyone's screaming hallelujahs. This is the greatest idea. And you just have this feeling in the back of your mind that's like, I don't know. I just don't know. And the pressure to be quiet can be pretty intense. So that's groupthink. And there's all sorts of triggers for each of these that I go about in the book as well. Attribution error is a particularly evil one. And if you deal with inclusiveness issues in your company, I would say it really comes down to this, where you start making broad generalizations about other people based on who they are or what they are. You know, where this could play out is, you know, if I'm late to a meeting, it's because I got stuck in traffic, I had other priorities, I had an emergency come up. There's a million because of. If this other person who is working against me, in my view, is late to the meeting, well, they're lazy or they don't care or this or that. There's a million they are's instead of because of. So there's an automatically built-in double standard in how we view ourselves versus others, especially in a conflict type of situation. So attribution error, whether it's fundamental attribution, which is about a person, or ultimate attribution, which is about a whole group of people. Again, those HR people, those finance people, those service people, those marketing people, whatever. That's a trap that you might be falling into if you find yourself saying those things. And then outgrouping could happen at any level, where you automatically discount someone who is not in your group. There's something called the minimal group paradigm. If you form a group, it could be just a couple people, and it could be over anything. It could be over something completely irrelevant. But instinctively, we will start to view people in our group as better and treat them preferentially. The side of that means if you're not in your group, you're not better, and you won't get preferential treatment automatically. It takes effort. This is a tribalism instinct that's very much built into it and can be very damaging within organizations. And one thing I can tell you from our defense work, if you have outgrouping plus attribution error in a society, that is a great precursor of genocide. So these are truly evil things that are a dark side of this blindness that we're all vulnerable to. So we formed our team. We've built what we think is a consensus after we've made our decision. Now we've got to make the question, do we go? Do we just jump in, take the leap, give it a shot? I mean, even the way we talk about it, it's life or death, right? It's my career depends on this. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But are we trying to justify, or are we trying to substantiate it's the right idea? One of the most common problems is the sunk cost fallacy. I don't know if you ever heard of the floating hockey stick, where you have a line that's basically flat, and you're sure that any day now the sales are going to go like this. But you know, something else happened, so it pushed it out a little further. But it's still going to turn any day now. And, well, not yet, but you know, a little more money invested, it just pushes further and further out. So you start throwing good money after bad again and again, and it's very difficult to get away from an investment that we've already put in. Framing effects are another big problem. I mean, here's the old tired analogy that, you know, is the glass half full or half empty. I mean, my son's an engineering student. He would probably look at it and say, it's a design flaw, the glass is too big. But be that as it may, the issue here is the way you present information could have a huge impact on how it's interpreted and decisions you make. Let's say we do a study about a new product or a new feature. And I may say, you know what, we have to launch this. We got to do it. This study says 1 out of 3 customers absolutely love it. So we've got to do it. Or I could say, we can't do this. This would be a huge mistake. We talked to 2 out of 3 customers, not just a majority, 2/3 of our customers, and you know what? They don't love it. So I just said the same thing 2 different ways, and you get the same conclusion. There's a very famous study by Daniel Kahneman about disease treatments on a cruise ship that gets at this. And here's a mouthful for you: hyperbolic discounting. This is one of my favorites. So hyperbolic discounting is also sometimes called present bias, where we tend to go for the quick win, the short-term money, even though it means giving up a bigger gain further on. So if I say to you, I'll give you $100 right now, or I'll give you $110 in a month, I guarantee you, most people out there, most of you would say, I'll take the $100 right now. But what if I said instead, in 14 months, I'll give you $100, or in 15 months, I'll give you 110. Most people will choose the 110. But logically, it's the exact same problem, right? I mean, there's a point where I'm going to give you money, or you can wait a month and get $10 more. So it's irrelevant how long you have to wait, really, unless you think something's going to happen to me, but then you're not going to get anything, so it doesn't matter. But that's hyperbolic discounting. It was that exact problem was researched by George Ainsley back in, I think, 1981. And the other side of this is it also tends to make us take foolish risks. The reason it's called that is if you've taken finance classes in business school, you know that the discount curve that, the further out you get, the less things are worth, should be exponential. But when you map what people actually do, it looks more like a hyperbola. So hence hyperbolic discounting. So what should we do? If we can engage that other side of our brain, then what we should do instead is, instead of simplifying, we should take a step back and evaluate. We should think backwards. What information do we need to make the decision? And then go from there. We should integrate with other ideas, other perspectives. We should red team our own ideas. We should appoint ambassadors and liaisons to actively solicit other opinion. And then in the end, take a step back and substantiate. But that means redefining failure. It means taking a very different approach to innovation. It means getting a completely different mindset and learning from mistakes, as well as celebrating the process. So I'm going to talk for just a second about these, and then I promise I'll open up for questions. Here's something that is going to sound a bit controversial, especially coming from a guy who's such a quant nerd like myself, or I'm essentially a data guy. Data-driven decision-making is the wrong thing to do. That only gets you part of the way there. Data are like the letters and words in a book. What you want is information-driven decision-making. Information is the story the book tells. So if it's your birthday and I come to your house and I dump some flour, sugar, eggs, and milk on your counter and say, here's your cake, you'd probably kick me out, right? It would be a pretty mean thing to do, quite honestly. But that's what we do when we expect people to make data-driven decisions. If I gave you all the ingredients, all the data, and said, bake me a cake, but I didn't provide an objective, what type of cake, an analysis plan, what recipe, I'd end up with a million different cakes. Even though you all started with the exact same thing, you may come out with completely different results, because that's a data-driven process versus an information-driven process. And in my experience, most of the clients, if not all the clients I've worked with over the years, very much are data-rich and information-poor. So making that transition is a big part about moving to an evaluate mindset. Going to more of an integrated mindset comes with an appreciation that we don't make decisions in a vacuum. We make decisions balanced on a spider web. So we are influenced by everything that happens behind us, everything that happens in front of us, and every step we take, every step, reverberates through the entire net. So instead of scenario planning where I'm just thinking, okay, I've got 4 options, I'm going to pick one, you need to do more of a decision analysis. Think about, what are the assumptions I'm making? What are the impacts that my moves can have? What's this going to do over here? If these people do this, what does that do to my plans? What happens to my supply chain? What happens to my delivery chain? All these things are considerations that you need to think about. You have to picture yourself on that spider web and think about, if I step on this part of the web, who's going to feel it? And I better get them involved. So what to watch out for? There are agents of blindness out there. And these things are dangerous, and they tend to make blindness last and spread. And the first one is, quite frankly, blindness works for some people. They may be very charismatic or very good at telling a story or good at playing the system. We had one case where a data science team had to run an analysis over and over and over again because it wasn't producing the result that our client wanted to see. He kept changing assumptions. So we finally said, just stop. And obviously wasn't happy about that. But You know, there's a well-known saying from Richard Coase that if you torture the data long enough, it'll confess to anything. And that's what was happening there. So you got to watch out for that. Borrowing from the Barrier book, there are gospels and ghosts out there. There are gospels that are rules you can never violate, even if they don't apply. So I'd question, does the rule really apply in this situation? And even worse, there are ghosts. There are things, well, it's just the way we've always done things here. But look at the world we live in now. The way we've always done things is gone, at least for the foreseeable future. So the ghosts that are guiding your processes and decision-making may need to be gone too, or at least updated. Lack of inclusiveness is a surefire way to institutionalize blindness in your organization. And to me, that goes well beyond demographics. That even goes well beyond making sure the right people are in the right meetings. This is, how do you actually make decisions? And are you falling into this Unify blind spot where you're outgrouping some people or committing some attribution errors? And that could mean, again, someone from a particular department isn't being inclusive. So I think we need to broaden our definition of what inclusiveness means to what someone does for the company, in addition to just who they are and what their background is. Learned helplessness is a phenomenon that was studied by a guy named Marty Seligman through some pretty cruel experiments, quite frankly. But the meaning there is, if someone is just smacked every time they try, every time they speak up, they're yelled at, every time they try to make things better, they're shut down, they're going to give up after a while and just keep their head down and try to get through the day. But they may have the answer, and that's another form of blindness that gets institutionalized. Time pressure, inertia are other things as well that I talk about in more detail in the book. So what's the responsibility of leaders? The first thing is to take action and figure out where you are. Assess the person, the process, and the place. We've partnered with Phil Dixon, who's the CEO and founder of the Oxford Brain Institute. He's developed a great profile to measure threats. You know, what are the threats that attack the brain? And by the way, I actually met Phil at another EMP event where we both were presenting and realized we thought similarly. He's out here in North Carolina. We struck up a friendship and now we're collaborating, all sorts of stuff. But anyways, he's got this great assessment that we've been working with to look at someone's personal threat profile. But then that's the person. So that tells you where your vulnerabilities are. But then when you start to get into how those are applied, where are the blind spots in terms of the process you make? And then even if you fix those, are there things that are going to get in the way, the barriers that exist? So if you can attack the threats, you can attack the blind spots and the barriers, then you could really free your organization to do amazing things. But assessing isn't enough. Then you've got to diagnose the root causes and then effect a cure. Some of those things you could just do yourself, quite honestly, most of them. Some may require a little deeper dive, but nevertheless, these things can all be fixed, and they could all be fixed surprisingly easily if you have the right approach and the right strategies. But then leaders need to set the tone. You need to redefine failure and not punish learning as much as you can. You know, the reality is sometimes a program ends, some jobs may be lost, but then do you help them? Do you try to place in the company, or at least help place them elsewhere, etc.? Or is it simply something to be ashamed of? You failed, now you're out. Do you lead by example? Do you have a truly open culture where dissent is not only able to be expressed, but it's welcome? And there are mechanisms to get dissent or different opinions. Do you have a unified mission? I was lucky enough to be on the USS Nimitz for a few days out at sea. And the tech was cool, no question, as was, you know, taken off from a catapult shot. But the coolest thing, quite frankly, were the people. And everybody said the same thing. What we do here is the most important thing that happens on this ship. It didn't matter if it was the people in the mess hall, the people doing maintenance, the pilots, it didn't matter. Everybody knew exactly how they fit into the mission. And it just struck me that's something every organization should strive for. And then the last two things, I'd say never compromise your values, period. At the end of the day, all you have is your integrity. And you can't lose that. And then make sure you promote total inclusiveness. So if you do those things, I love this quote from President Kennedy, we're not here to curse the darkness. This is how we're wired. but to light the candle that can guide us through that darkness to a safe and sane future. So anyway, I know there was a lot of information in a very short period of time, but if you'd like to stay informed and especially have me notify you when the book comes out or have stay up on our latest research, just shoot us an email, teamhealth@nsi.com.
Right.
We'll make sure that happens.
Okay,
How's
great,
that,
Tom.
Scott?
That's great. So Tom, let's get into this for a minute because we're getting some questions here and we've got some a few minutes left, but I want to get to a couple of critical questions from our viewers.
Sure.
And you mentioned something about scenario planning, and that's what we prescribe right now, and the fact that you really need to look at that entire web when you're doing scenario planning. And I think you touched on decision making. That was extremely critical. But I want to take a different slant here. There's a lot of focus right now on artificial intelligence and machine learning. And how does that help cure or hinder organization blindness?
That is a great question, Scott, and thank you for asking that. So first, let me say I'm a big believer in AI and machine learning. We do a great deal of it. We're doing more and more of it. But in the end of the day, it's not a panacea that's going to cure all of our ills. It's a tool. It's a methodology. It's basically regression and clustering at the end of the day. I mean, it's much more than that now. What I will say is there are certain cases where absolutely it can help you avoid falling into simplified traps. If you have a very well-defined world with assumptions that don't change, but you need a few things. You need a big training data set with tons of data, and you need to be sure that what you're coding in that training data set is correct, and you can put your own biases into how you've said, this is a yes, this is a no, number one. Number two, don't stretch it beyond its intended purpose. Some of these algorithms are built for certain things. The other thing, I have a story I'd love to tell, but I don't want to take up the time, but be careful about the assumptions you're making. Assumptions can change. Everybody was very fired up about Deep Blue beating Gary Kasparov and the Chinese AI system winning the game. Oh, but guess what? Those games have set rules and you can't cheat. Just look at the Maginot Line in France. The German, that was supposed to be by all the rules impenetrable. The Germans just went around it. And then next thing you know, there was Dunkirk. So to avoid your own Dunkirk, just be careful that you're not strapping a camera onto a rear view mirror, projecting it forward and thinking you're peering into the future, because that's all AI is. It's taking the past and predicting the future. If the future assumptions change or don't apply, it's not the right way to go.
Yeah. Another question, and only because this is in the news today, it has been for the past week, and that is the effect of people in quarantine. And there's a relationship to how organizations operate. You use a term called learned helplessness in the context of the current environment, but also broader than that in terms of organizations. What does that mean, this idea of learned helplessness?
Well, again, it's that I am powerless to affect any change, that I might as well just give up, because no matter what I do, it's not going to make a difference. And you're right, Scott, with greater social isolation, we don't have that peer group cheering us on as easily. We're dealing with a whole other set of threats and a whole lot of other set of pressures. So it's very easy to just try to get done what you need to get done and not rock the boat. But sometimes the boat needs to be rocked. And if that learned helplessness is there, then you've got these great, smart, talented people out there that could really help you course correct, but they just feel like, what's the point?
Yeah, it's a great point. And we'll also be seeing the impacts of this, obviously, for the next coming months and years. Another kind of related question, but let me just take one sidestep here. When you look at all of this for our viewers, what do you see as the ROI? What is the ROI, the return on investment of unleashing the full potential of the workforce, of getting past these blind spots? Where do you see the ROI here?
Well, I think, Scott, you can start to see it come in a couple different ways. I mean, first, you're going to make better decisions, which means you should have greater financial success. But beyond that, if you start valuing and including and redefining team within your organization, then you'll have much higher engagement. And with engagement, you'll have much lower turnover, better productivity, a better workplace. And quite honestly, your blood pressure will be a whole lot lower if you could get some of the emotion out of the decision making.
Yeah, that's very true. Some more questions here for our viewers. Well, this comes from your personal experience. You work with some major parts of the government, some major enterprises. How do you personally see this recovery, this rebound unfolding over the coming months? Let's say, yeah.
I'm actually very optimistic, Scott. I mean, I have seen this bring out the best in people in a lot of ways. I mean, we have, some of our neighbors are sewing masks for elderly folks in our neighborhood who can't do it themselves. We have farms out here in North Carolina, a few miles out, that have banded together because they can't get their food into the distribution system, and you could just buy direct from the farms and it'll deliver to your door. I see people helping people everywhere. And beyond that, if you look historically, this has happened before. It's probably going to happen again. We've always recovered. We're a very resilient country. We're a very resilient species globally. So I don't know, maybe I'm an eternal optimist, but I see us coming together and coming out of this. I think things are going to be different for a long time. And there's going to be a lot of pain from the people who lost their jobs and the companies that have had to close. But I'm confident that we'll come back.
Yeah. Well, we're certainly optimistic as well. Tell us about when's the release of the book itself, because we're looking forward to it. Again, people are still talking about the fear barrier from your presentation now 3 years ago. So tell us what's the release date coming up?
Right now, we're looking at the beginning of June. But again, shoot me a note at teamhealth@nsiteam.com, and I'll make sure anyone who's interested, I'll let you know when the book is available and exactly where to get it.
That's great. Well, Tom, we appreciate your time today. This has been terrific. For those of you that are viewing this, a recorded version of this will be up on our E&P TV channel in the next couple of days. We'll also send you an email directly to your email box with Tom's direct connection. Feel free to reach out to him with your questions. Tom, we'll have you back upon the release of the book for sure. And again, stay safe and healthy. I'm going to just put up our closing connection here. If we can do this. And again, we'll look forward to seeing you on this Thursday, April 30th at 11 a.m., same events page. Look forward to seeing you then. Tom, thanks again for participating in the session today, and we'll look forward to having you back here in the next coming months. Stay safe.
Thanks so much, Scott. Yeah, thanks. Stay safe. And to all you out there, thank you so much, and be well.
Thanks again.